Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was turned into a Nomu, but retained his consciousness. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. Silence was the first lie. It wasn't true silence, the peaceful void of a quiet room or the dead of night. This was a thick, oppressive silence, the kind that pressed in on you from all sides. It was the silence of the deep ocean, a pressure that filled the ears and muffled the world into a dull, rhythmic thrumming. That thrum was the second lie, a slow, heavy beat that mimicked a heart but felt profoundly alien. It was too slow, too powerful. It was the sound of a sleeping leviathan, and he was trapped inside it. Who was he? Izuku Midoriya. The name surfaced from the murk like a bubble of air from a drowning man. It felt distant, a label for a person he used to know. With the name came flashes, chaotic and violent. The grit of dust in his teeth. The searing pain of broken bones, so many broken bones. The face of Tamura Shigaraki, twisted in a rictus of manic glee. The desperate, weakening smile of all might. The roar of battle, the screams of friends, the feeling of one for all surging, breaking, tearing him apart from the inside out. And then, the fluid. He was floating. Suspended. He tried to open his eyes, but the lids felt as heavy as lead shutters. When he finally forced them open, the world was a warped, green-tinted nightmare. Light filtered through the translucent liquid, bending and distorting everything outside his prison into a meaningless swirl of color and shadow. He couldn't breathe, yet he wasn't choking. A tube, thin and invasive, snaked down his throat, providing something. It wasn't air. It was a chemical cocktail that kept his lungs from screaming for release while the fluid outside did the work. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to lance through the sluggish fog of his consciousness. He needed to move. He needed to get out. He sent a command, the most basic neurological impulse, from his brain to his limbs. Move your arm. Nothing happened. He tried again, pouring more will into it. Clench your fist. He focused on the memory of his hand, the scarred knuckles, the familiar shape. But the limb that drifted in his peripheral vision was not his. It was larger, thicker, the skin a pale, corpse-like gray, crisscrossed with thick, dark suture marks that looked like railroad tracks on dead flesh. A phantom itch crawled along a phantom scar on an arm that was no longer his. The terror that followed was no longer cold and sharp. It was a hot, all-consuming supernova of horror that should have made him scream. He did scream. A desperate, silent shriek that echoed only in the confines of his own skull. His body remained placid, floating serenely in its amniotic prison. He was a ghost in a shell, a pilot in a mech with all the controls severed. Where am I? What have they done to me? The muffled world outside began to resolve. The thrumming sound was accompanied by voices, distorted by the fluid and glass. Stability holding at 98%. Remarkable, one voice said. It was old, raspy, and filled with a dry, clinical pride. The subject's unique cellular resilience, combined with the regenerative properties of the base quirk, has created a perfect symbiosis. The body accepted the additional quirks without any signs of cognitive decay or tissue rejection. Cognitive decay is the point, Doctor. Another voice rasped, this one younger, dripping with impatient, sandpapery malice. Shigaraki. The name scraped across Izuku's mind like a rusty nail. I don't want it thinking. I want it to obey. Is it ready? Patience, Tamura Shigaraki. A third voice intoned. This one was different. It was calm, cultured, and carried an ancient, suffocating weight. It resonated not just in the fluid, but deep within Izuku's bones, a vibration of pure malevolence. All for one. A masterpiece cannot be rushed. Dr. Garaki has not merely built a weapon, he has crafted a living insult to everything our enemies hold dear. Izuku's silent screaming intensified. He was a specimen. A project. A thing. He thrashed against the invisible walls of his own mind, a frantic, useless struggle. The figures outside his tube swam into focus. Dr. Garaki, a portly man in goggles, scribbled on a datapad. Shigaraki stood beside him, his posture tense with anticipation, his skeletal hand mask now gone, revealing a face scarred by his own decay but alight with triumphant cruelty. And behind them, a large monitor flickered to life, showing the impassive, life-support-riddled face of All for One. The base template was promising. Garaki continued, gesturing toward Izuku's tube with a flourish. A strong, young body already accustomed to channeling immense power. It made the vessel incredibly pliable. We started, of course, with the high-end foundation. Super regeneration is the linchpin. Without it, the subject's own power would have disintegrated the body moments after activation. Shigaraki cackled, a dry, rattling sound. So Deku's own quirk would have killed him. Poetic, my quirk. One for all. Izuku desperately reached for it, for that familiar, comforting inferno of power passed down through generations. He could feel it, but it was different. It was no longer a wellspring of heroic energy. It was a chained beast, a raging nuclear core crammed into a containment vessel that was groaning under the strain. It was there, but it was tainted, warped by the other energies now forced to share its space. Indeed, Garaki said, puffing out his chest. To complement it, we added shock absorption. Any kinetic force directed at the creature will simply be nullified and stored. Punches, bullets, explosions, they will only serve to make it stronger. Then, for offensive capability, we have kinetic booster. The more it moves, the faster and more powerful its subsequent movements become, a self-perpetuating engine of destruction. We also included a rudimentary rivet stab quirk for piercing attacks and an enhanced sensory package, though the subject's vision and hearing will be altered. The distorted view. The muffled sound. It wasn't just the tube. It was him. This was his reality now. It is a symphony of stolen potential. All for One's voice echoed from the monitor. But the true masterstroke, Doctor, is the consciousness. Confirm its erasure. Of course, Master, Garaki said, tapping a few commands into his console. A low hum vibrated through the fluid, and a soft blue light scanned Izuku's body from head to toe. On a monitor nearby, brainwave patterns displayed as a series of placid, uncomplicated lines. As you can see, only the brainstem and cerebellum show significant activity, instinct, motor function, response to stimuli, all present. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of identity, memory, and self-awareness, is dormant. Wiped clean. Izuku Midoriya is gone. All that remains is our Nomu, codenamed Ninth Circle in honor of its intended purpose. Ninth! Shigaraki breathed, stepping closer to the glass. His red eyes, burning with hatred, bored into Izuku's own. The ninth holder of One for All, now the ultimate tool to tear down Hero Society. It's perfect. It will hunt his friends. It will stand on the rubble of UA. And when we finally face All Might, it will be his own successor who crushes the life from his body. The words were like acid, dissolving the last vestiges of Izuku's hope. Despair washed over him in a black tide. This was a nightmare from which he would never wake. They hadn't just killed him, they had desecrated his very soul, turning his body into a puppet and his legacy into a curse. His dream of saving people with a smile was now a monster designed to slaughter them. He thought of his mother, her smile, the worry in her eyes. He thought of All Might, who had looked at a quirkless, worthless boy and seen a hero. He thought of Uraraka's determined face, Ida's rigid shopping motions, Todoroki's quiet friendship. He thought of Bakugo, of their shared history of fire and pain and a strange, unspoken bond. Their faces, their voices, everything he held dear, they would all be destroyed by his own hands. The despair was so absolute, so profound, it paradoxically created a single, diamond-hard point of clarity in the fog. No, the word was not a thought. It was a fundamental rejection of reality. It was the core of who he was, the tiny, quirkless boy who ran towards the sludge villain when all the pro-heroes stood back. It was the student who shattered his bones again and again rather than let someone get hurt. I will not let you. The black tide of despair receded, fought back by a defiant, incandescent rage. And deep within him, something answered. It started as a flicker. In the vast, internal space of his mindscape, a place that was usually hazy and filled with the silent, watchful figures of his predecessors, a violent storm was brewing. The tendrils of All for One's malevolent programming, the erasure sequence Garaki was so proud of, were like black, oily vines, wrapping around the central pillar of light that was one for all, trying to snuff it out. But the pillar was not just one light. It was 9. A voice, the very first, spoke with a ghostly echo, filled with an ancient, sorrowful fury. He is my brother's legacy of failure. He will not claim this boy as he claimed me. Yoichi Shigaraki, the first, his ethereal form little more than a wisp, blazed with sudden, fierce light, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Another voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the mental chaos. This is not how it ends. The boy's will is strong, but he is drowning in despair. We must be his anchor. The second user, grim and resolute, his presence a shield. He's a fighter. Just needs a push. The third user, his voice a low growl of agreement. The light of the other vestiges flared in response. Haikid Shinomori, whose danger sense had been useless against this insidious internal attack. Daigoro Banjo, whose black whip was formless in this mental realm. En, whose smoke screen could not hide him from himself. They were all there, their individual powers meaningless, their collective will everything. Then, one voice rose above the others, filled with a power that was equal parts fierce warrior and loving grandmother. Her light was the brightest, a radiant sun in the psychic gloom. Izuku, Nana Shimura, listen to me, my boy. Do you remember what I told you? A real hero doesn't just save people. A real hero saves hearts. We are here. We have not abandoned you. You hold our hopes. You hold our power. You are the 9th, and you are the one who will finish this. But you have to fight. Don't you dare surrender the body you worked so hard to make your own. It is yours. Claim it. Her words were a thunderclap in his soul. They were followed by a chorus of overlapping shouts, the voices of 8 heroes who had lived and died for the sake of the flame he now carried. Fight, 9th! The combined will of the vestiges slammed into Izuku's own consciousness like a defibrillator shocking a stopped heart. It was a torrent of power, hope, and righteous fury, a billion volts of pure defiance. The rage he felt was no longer the helpless fury of a victim. It was the focused, weaponized anger of a cornered hero. The black vines of All for One's programming sizzled and recoiled as if burned by a holy light. The connection between Izuku's mind and the Nomu's body, once severed, sparked to life. It was a raw, unfiltered connection, like grabbing a live power line. An agonizing jolt of sensory information flooded his brain. He felt everything. The cold of the fluid on his mutated skin. The pressure of the feeding tube in his esophagus. The unnatural density of his own muscle fibers. The faint hum of the lab's electronics. The slight shift in air pressure as Shigaraki took a step back. And beneath it all, the raging, barely contained furnace of One for All, now intertwined with the alien thrum of the other quirks. Outside the tube, the monitor displaying his brainwaves went haywire. The placid lines erupted into a chaotic, jagged storm of activity that looked like an earthquake on a seismograph. What is this? Garaki yelped, stumbling back from his console. Impossible! The erasure was total! There's nothing there to be conscious. Shigaraki stared, his red eyes wide. Is it fighting back? It can't be! The doctor shrieked, frantically typing. It's a neurological cascade failure! The conflicting quirks must be causing a seizure, but it wasn't a seizure. It was a declaration of war. Izuku gathered every ounce of his will, every scrap of power from the vestiges, every memory of his dream, and focused it on a single point. His new, monstrous right arm. Move! A tremor ran through the Nomu's body. A single finger, thick as a sausage and ending in a claw-like nail, twitched. It was the most triumphant moment of his life. It moved! Shigaraki snarled, a hint of fear creeping into his voice. It's not supposed to do that without a command. Master, the containment field is destabilizing. Garaki cried out, pointing at the thick, plasteel cylinder. The internal power output is spiking beyond all measurable limits. On the monitor, All for One's expressionless face watched, a flicker of what might have been fascination in his dark eyes. Incredible! His voice rumbled. It seems the soul of One for All is more stubborn than anticipated. Izuku didn't hear him. He was lost in the surge. He pulled on the power, not with the focused precision he had been trained to use, but with the raw, desperate strength of a drowning man clawing for the surface. One for all answered, a green lightning inferno. The implanted quirks, designed to be slaves to UFO's will, were caught in the psychic blast and responded to the only command now present in the system, Izuku's overwhelming, primal need to be free. Break. A network of hairline cracks, glowing with faint green energy, spiderwebbed across the surface of the tube. The hum of the machinery rose to a piercing shriek. "Shut it down! Sedate it!" Shigaraki screamed, scratching furiously at his neck. But it was too late. With a final, silent roar that shook the foundations of his own soul, Izuku pushed. The world erupted in a cataclysm of sound and force. The plasteel tube didn't just crack, it exploded. A tidal wave of viscous green fluid and razor-sharp shards of glass blasted outwards, shattering consoles and knocking Garaki off his feet. The Nomu's body, grotesquely huge and powerful, was thrown from its prison, slamming onto the cold, tiled floor with a wet, heavy thud. The feeding tube was ripped from Izuku's throat, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he took a breath. It was a ragged, horrific, gasping sound, like a faulty bellows, dragging air into lungs that felt alien and raw. The air smelled of ozone, antiseptic, and his own blood. He pushed himself up, his movements clumsy, disjointed. He was a puppeteer learning the strings of a new, terrifyingly powerful puppet. His head lolled on a neck that felt too thick. He looked down at his hands. They were massive, gray-skinned claws. He was a monster. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, but there was no time for despair. Not now. An instinct, deeper and more powerful than his own thoughts, screamed at him. It wasn't a heroic instinct. It was the instinct of a cornered animal. Escape. Contain it! Shigaraki shrieked, his rage overriding his shock. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched, fingers ready to decay this failed, rebellious masterpiece. Izuku's new body reacted before his mind could even process the threat. It was the kinetic booster quirk, engaging automatically. His clumsy push-up had been a movement. Shigaraki's lunge was another. The Nomu form, fueled by a sudden burst of speed it hadn't earned, twisted with a horrifying fluidity. It dodged Shigaraki's decaying touch by a hair's breadth and swung a massive, backhanded blow. Izuku screamed internally, "No! Don't hurt anyone!" But the body wasn't listening to nuance. It was listening to the primal command, survive. Escape. The blow, not even aimed properly, caught a bank of servers, smashing them into a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The force of the impact was staggering. Alarms blared, bathing the ruined laboratory in strobing red lights. "You worthless piece of filth!" Shigaraki raged. "After everything we gave you! I'll kill you myself!" The Nomu ignored him. Its head, with a grotesquely exposed brain pulsating under a clear cranial dome, swiveled around the room. Its new eyes, dead black orbs, took in the layout. There was one primary exit, a reinforced blast door. It charged. Its gait was a lumbering, terrifying run. Each step cracked the floor tiles. It was faster than something its size had any right to be. The kinetic booster was already working, each movement making the next one faster, stronger. "Stop it!" Garaki squealed from the floor, where he was crawling away from the wreckage. "Use the emergency protocols!" Automated turrets descended from the ceiling, spitting a hail of high-caliber rounds. Izuku flinched in his mind, bracing for the agony of being torn apart. But the bullets didn't tear. They thudded. They slammed into the Nomu's chest and back, the impacts feeling like hard pokes rather than piercing wounds. He felt his body absorb the energy, a strange, tingling sensation that made the muscles of his legs coil even tighter. Shock absorption. The bullets fell harmlessly to the floor, flattened and spent. The Nomu didn't even slow down. It lowered its shoulder and hit the blast door at full speed. The sound was deafening, a metallic shriek of tortured steel. The door, designed to withstand a hero raid, buckled, bent, and was torn from its hinges with an ungodly groan. Izuku was merely a passenger on this terrifying ride. He was watching through a monster's eyes as it carved a path of pure destruction, his own heroic principles a horrified whisper in the back of its skull. The vestiges were silent, their energy spent on breaking him free. Now, It was up to him to hold on, to not be erased by the primal instincts of the beast he now inhabited. He crashed through the doorway and into a sterile white corridor. Figures in lab coats and security gear scattered, screaming. He paid them no mind. The escape instinct was a beacon, pulling him forward, away from the lab, away from his creators. He smashed through wall after wall, the structure of the Jaka hospital ruins groaning around him. Concrete dust filled the air. Rebar screeched as it was torn apart by his unnatural strength. A piece of falling ceiling slammed into his shoulder, a flash of white-hot pain, followed immediately by the sickeningly fast, tingling knit of super regeneration closing the wound before it could even properly bleed. The chaos behind him was a symphony of his own making, Shigaraki's furious, impotent screams, Garaki's panicked orders, the continuous, futile blare of the alarms. He burst through one final wall, and was met not with concrete, but with night. Rain. Cold, clean rain fell from a starless sky, washing the dust and amniotic fluid from his monstrous form. He was in the ruined, cratered landscape surrounding the hospital. The air was fresh and open. He was out. He stumbled forward, his new body finally beginning to flag as the initial adrenaline surge wore off. He was still propelled by the desperate need to put distance between himself and that laboratory of horrors. He ran, a clumsy, loping gait, into the skeletal remains of a nearby forest, the dead trees like grasping claws in the gloom. He ran until his borrowed lungs burned and the primal panic began to subside, leaving a hollow, aching void in its place. He finally collapsed at the foot of a massive, gnarled oak, his hulking body slumping against its trunk. The rain continued to fall, a steady, mournful rhythm. For a long moment, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the patter of water on leaves and exposed flesh. The escape was over. The adrenaline was gone. He was alone. In the dark. In the rain, he was free. And he was a monster. Slowly, shakily, he lifted a hand, a gray, three-fingered claw, and stared at it in the gloom. This was his hand now. This body, this prison of scarred flesh and stolen power, was his. A sound tried to escape his throat. It was meant to be a sob, a cry of utter, soul-crushing despair for the boy he had been and the life he had lost. But his vocal cords were not his own anymore. They were twisted, re-engineered for roars and shrieks, not for human grief. What came out was a low, guttural, inhuman growl that echoed through the dead forest, a sound of pure agony. It was the sound of a waking nightmare, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The world was a smear of rain-slick darkness and the thunderous, clumsy beat of his own footsteps. He didn't know how long he ran, only that the laboratory, the tube, and the face of Tamura Shigaraki had to be left far behind. The primal, animalistic part of his new brain, the part that Dr. Garaki had intended to be the only part, screamed a single, repeating mantra: danger, behind, safety, ahead. His legs, thick as tree trunks and corded with unnaturally dense muscle, churned through the muddy forest floor. Branches that would have checked a normal man's sprint snapped like twigs against his hide. He was a runaway engine of flesh, fueled by terror and piloted by a ghost. His enhanced senses were a curse. Every drop of rain felt like a tiny needle prick on his exposed skin and the raw, pulsating mass of his brain. The smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and his own alien blood was a thick, cloying miasma in his sinuses. The sound of his own passage, the cracking of wood, the squelch of mud, the horrific, rasping wheeze of his breathing, was a deafening cacophony. He was trapped in a sensory overload tank of his own body. He eventually stumbled out of the skeletal woods and onto the hard, cracked asphalt of a forgotten road. The city glowed in the distance, a hazy smear of orange and white light against the bruised purple of the night sky. It was a beacon of everything he had lost, a world of people, of warmth, of normalcy, that would now see him only as a threat to be extinguished. The animal instinct to flee warred with a deep, human ache for home, a conflict so violent it brought him to a staggering halt. He couldn't go there. He couldn't go anywhere. A new instinct surfaced, quieter but just as insistent. Hide. Go deep. Go dark. His head swiveled, the motion unnervingly smooth and silent. His vision, while distorted at the periphery, was incredibly sharp in the dark. He spotted it across the derelict industrial park, a gaping, shadowed maw in the earth. A concrete archway overgrown with weeds and slick with moss, leading down into blackness. The entrance to an abandoned subway line, a relic of a time before the city's expansion had rendered it obsolete. It was perfect. A wound in the earth, a place for forgotten things. A tomb. He moved toward it, his gait now a slow, heavy shamble. The frenetic energy of the escape had burned away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. His massive body, a miracle of bioengineering, felt like a suit of lead armor he couldn't take off. Each step was a monumental effort of will. He descended the crumbling concrete stairs, his heavy footfalls echoing in the enclosed space. The air grew cool and damp, thick with the smell of mildew, stagnant water, and decay. It was a place of death and neglect, and it felt, horrifyingly, like a homecoming. The tunnel stretched out before him, a tube of absolute blackness punctuated only by the faint, distant glow of the entrance behind him. He walked deeper, letting the darkness swallow him whole. His footsteps splashed through shallow puddles of collected rainwater. The sounds bounced off the curved, tiled walls, creating a disorienting echo chamber. A drip from the ceiling. The scuttling of a rat. The soft, wet sound of his own bare feet on the grimy floor. He continued until the light from the entrance was a dim, insignificant memory, and then he simply stopped. He stood there in the oppressive dark for a long time, the only movement the slow, rhythmic pulsation of the brain exposed on his skull. The adrenaline was gone. The primal fear was gone. All that remained was a cold, hollow ache. The ghost in the machine was finally alone with the machine, and the silence was terrifying. He needed to take stock. He needed to understand what he was. His internal self, the consciousness of Izuku Midoriya, was cowering in a corner of his own mind, but he knew he couldn't stay there. He had to face this. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his left arm. The motion was stiff, the muscles bunched in unfamiliar ways. He brought the hand closer to his face. In the near-total darkness, he could barely make out its shape, but he could feel it. 3 thick fingers and a thumb, all ending in hard, blunt claws. The skin was leathery and cool to the touch. He ran a finger along the thick, raised suture line that snaked up his forearm, a gruesome reminder that he was a thing that had been stitched together. He remembered the skin of his old hand, the network of fine lines, the calluses from training, the scar from his second fight with Kaken. That hand was gone. This grotesque appendage was its replacement. A wave of nausea, potent and crippling, rolled through him. He fought it down. He had to know. He had to see. He turned and began to shuffle back the way he came, his steps hesitant. He followed the faint sound of dripping water until he found its source. A steady leak from a crack in the ceiling had formed a large, shallow puddle on the station platform. The surface was still, disturbed only by the periodic plink of a falling drop. He stood over it, his heart, or the heavy, monstrous organ that now served as one, pounding a slow, dread-filled rhythm. The dim light from the distant entrance cast a long, distorted shadow over the water. He could see a shape reflected there, a silhouette of something huge and misshapen. "It's not me," he told himself, a frantic, desperate lie. "It's just a shadow. It's a trick of the light." He forced himself to kneel. The motion was awkward, his new joints bending at strange angles. He lowered his head, bringing his face closer to the dark, still surface of the water. He held his breath, and he saw. The face that stared back at him from the murky reflection was a thing of pure nightmare. The first thing he truly registered was the brain. It was the centerpiece of the horror, a grotesque crown of living tissue. His brain, his own mind, was exposed to the world, pulsating obscenely with every thought, every beat of his heart. It was covered by a thin, transparent membrane of hardened tissue, like a clear skullcap, but that offered no comfort. It was a raw, visceral violation, as if his very soul had been flayed open for all to see. His eyes, his kind green eyes, the ones his mother said were just like his father's, were gone. In their place were 2 solid black orbs, devoid of pupil, sclera, or iris. They were the eyes of a deep-sea fish, dead and emotionless, reflecting the faint light with a flat, soulless sheen. But behind them, he was still there. He could feel himself looking out of them, a terrified prisoner peering through the windows of his own private hell. His nose and mouth had been fused and pulled forward into a hard, beak-like structure, reminiscent of a bird of prey. The lipless seam of his mouth was a grim, straight line. He tried to part his lips, to see if he still had teeth, but the structure was rigid, unmoving. His skin was a patchwork of pale gray and angry, red scar tissue. The suture marks he'd felt on his arm were everywhere, crisscrossing his chest, his neck, his face. He looked like a macabre doll that had been torn apart, and crudely stitched back together by a madman. This was not an injury. This was not a costume. This was him. This hulking, freakish creature, with its exposed brain and dead eyes and monstrous form, was Izuku. The sight broke something deep inside him. The last, fragile thread of denial snapped. A sound began to build in his chest, a wave of grief so powerful it felt like it would tear his new body apart. It was a desperate, keening sob for his mother, for his friends, for his dream, for the boy who used to scribble hero analysis in his notebooks. He wanted to cry. He needed the release of tears, the simple, human act of weeping. He opened his mouth, the rigid, beak-like maw, and pushed the sound out. But a sob did not come. What erupted from his throat was a sound that defied nature. It was a roar. A horrifying, guttural, bestial roar that was part grinding stone, part tearing metal, part animalistic pain. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and it was not human. The force of it shook his massive frame. It blasted across the subway station, the acoustic power so immense it shattered the stillness, and sent rats scattering into the deep tunnels. The sound echoed back at him, alien and monstrous, and he realized with a fresh stab of horror that he couldn't even grieve properly. He couldn't speak. He couldn't scream. He couldn't cry. He could only make the sounds of a monster. The roar faded into a ragged, wheezing gasp. He remained kneeling, his monstrous head bowed, his claws digging into the grimy concrete of the platform. The reflection in the puddle stared back unmoved. The monster was still there. He was trapped. Utterly and completely trapped. Rage, hot and blinding, replaced the grief. It was a different rage from the defiant fury in the lab. This was the impotent rage of a caged animal. A rage against Garaki. Against Shigaraki. Against all for one. But most of all, a rage against this new body, this prison of flesh. He surged to his feet and lashed out. His fist, a hammer of bone and mutated muscle, connected with a thick, concrete support pillar. He expected pain. He expected the sickening crunch of breaking bones, a sensation he was intimately familiar with. He was braced for it. He felt almost nothing. There was a dull, heavy impact, a vibration that ran up his arm, but it wasn't painful. It was absorbed. The pillar, however, was not so fortunate. It didn't just crack. It exploded. A cloud of concrete dust erupted outwards as the pillar disintegrated, turning to rubble and gravel from the point of impact. The reinforced steel bars within groaned and twisted like licorice. Above, the ceiling sagged, and a shower of dirt and debris rained down. He stared, his mind reeling. He looked from the destroyed pillar to his fist. There wasn't a scratch on it. Not a single bruised knuckle. He could feel the kinetic energy he had just unleashed, but instead of damaging him, it felt like it had been eaten. The shock absorption quirk. It wasn't just defensive. It negated the Newtonian absolute of equal and opposite reaction. He could hit with unimaginable force and suffer no consequence. A low hum started in his muscles, a feeling of coiled, potential energy. The kinetic booster. His violent outburst had started the engine. He felt a terrifying urge to move again, to hit something else, to experience the escalating power. He stumbled back, away from the collapsing section of the ceiling, his mind racing. He could feel the quirks now, not just as abstract concepts Garaki had listed, but as tangible parts of his being. The constant, subtle tingle of superregeneration was a low background hum, tirelessly working to repair the microscopic tears in his muscles from his frantic escape. The shock absorption was a strange numbness, a void where pain should be. The kinetic booster was a thrumming vibration, an eager promise of greater violence. And beneath them all, one for all, it was no longer the warm, comforting presence he had come to know. It was a nuclear reactor shoved into a shoebox. A raging, celestial storm crammed into his chest, screaming for release. The green lightning he was used to seeing was now shot through with angry, erratic sparks of red. It felt corrupted, tainted by the proximity of the other quirks, by the malevolent science that had reshaped his body. It was fighting against its cage, against the other powers, against the very flesh that contained it. He feared that if he tried to call on it, to use it as he once had, the resulting explosion would vaporize him and half the city block above. It was too much power, too much rage, all of it barely held in check by a body he didn't know how to control. He was a walking, breathing time bomb. A monster with the power of a god trapped inside him. The sheer scale of his new reality was too much. The horror of his reflection, the loss of his voice, the terrifying power thrumming in his veins, the raging storm in his soul, it all coalesced into a single point of overwhelming despair. He slumped against the tiled wall, sliding down to the floor, the grating sound of his hide against the ceramic tile setting his teeth on edge. It's over, he thought, the words a leaden weight in his mind. This is it. I can't be a hero. I can't even be human. I'm just this thing. Maybe it would be better if I just stopped. Let the monster take over. Let Izuku Midoriya die for good. The thought was seductive. It promised an end to the pain, to the horror, to the responsibility. The primal instincts of the Nomu were always there, a low growl in the back of his mind. Hunger. Aggression. The desire for simple, uncomplicated action. It would be so easy to let go. To let the ghost fade and leave only the machine. His control began to slip. The disciplined mind of a hero in training was losing its grip, eroded by a tsunami of despair. And then, a light. It wasn't a physical light. It was in his mindscape, the internal world where the vestiges resided. That space, usually a calm, hazy forum, was now a roiling tempest of black clouds and angry red lightning, mirroring the state of one for all within him. But in the center of that storm, a single, soft point of light began to glow. It expanded, pushing back the darkness. It was a warm, gentle light, the light of a summer dawn. And from it, a voice emerged, cutting through his despair like a lighthouse beam through fog. Izuku. The voice was kind, familiar. It was filled with a strength that was both fierce and gentle. Nana Shimura. His mental self, a battered, translucent echo of his former body, looked up. He saw her then, her ethereal form radiating warmth. Her smile was sad, but her eyes were full of an unbreakable resolve. Don't you dare give up, she said, her voice echoing in the vastness of his consciousness. I know it hurts. I know this is a nightmare, but the boy who shattered his own body to save one person is still in there. The hero who never, ever gives up is still in there. We are here with you. You are not alone. Her presence was an anchor in the storm of his emotions. The crushing weight of despair lessened, just slightly. She's right, Ninth. A new voice growled, cutting and sharp. The light of the second user, a harder, more intense silver, flared beside Nana's. His form was grim, severe, his arms crossed. Wallowing in self-pity is a luxury you don't have. Your body is a weapon. Your mind is the only safety catch. You lose control, you become exactly what All for One wanted you to be. Get a grip, easy for you to say. The third user added, his voice a low rumble. You're not the one who has to look at that in the mirror. But he's not wrong. Despair is a poison. Right now you need to be practical. Izuku's mind reeled. They were talking to him. Truly talking to him, not just offering cryptic warnings or flashes of memory. You saved me? He projected, his thought a weak, trembling thing. In the lab, it was Nana who answered, her light softening. We helped. But it was your will, Izuku. Your absolute refusal to be erased. All for One's programming was designed to sever the consciousness from the flesh, to wipe the slate clean. But One for All is more than just a quirk. It's a collective will. It's a legacy of souls bound together. When the erasure sequence hit, we bound ourselves to you. We wrapped the core of your identity in our own, and we held on. It was your own stubborn spirit that gave us the strength to do it. AFO's science is formidable. The second user interjected, his tone clinical. But he has always underestimated the power of the human heart. It's his blind spot. He thinks of people as collections of quirks and desires. He doesn't understand sacrifice. He doesn't understand hope. That's why you're still here. A new, horrifying thought occurred to Izuku. The programming, is it gone? There was a moment of heavy silence in his mindscape. The storm clouds roiled. It was the second user who broke it, his voice grim. No, think of it like a virus. The third user elaborated. A dormant code buried deep in the operating system of this body. It's suppressed right now, by your consciousness and by our presence, but it's still there. The core commands obey all for one. Destroy his enemies. Eradicate the symbol of peace. If your will falters, if you give in to despair, if you lose yourself to the primal instincts of the Nomu, that virus could reactivate. The chill that went through Izuku was colder than any subway tunnel. He wasn't just fighting to stay sane. He was fighting to keep from becoming a sleeper agent, a puppet whose strings could be pulled by his worst enemy. Every moment of every day would be a battle for control of his own body. This is your fight now, Ninth. The second user stated, his silver light hardening. Your heroism won't be measured in villains captured or people saved with a smile anymore. It will be measured in inches, inside your own skull. It will be the fight to say no to the monster when it wants to roar. The fight to stay in control when the hunger comes. The fight to remain Izuku Midoriya when every fiber of this body screams for you to be a Nomu. And we will be here to help you fight, Nana added, her warm light a stark contrast to the second's harsh realism. Her hand, made of soft light, reached out and rested on the shoulder of his mental form. The warmth was startlingly real. You can't speak, but you can think. You can't smile, but you can feel. You have lost so much, but you have not lost yourself. That is the only victory that matters right now. The words of the vestiges settled over him, extinguishing the last embers of his rage and despair. They left behind something new. Something hard, and cold, and heavy. Resolve. He was a monster. He was a cage. He was a walking weapon with a dormant virus in his code. His dream was dead, buried under a mountain of mutated flesh and stolen quirks. But he was alive. And he was himself. He had survived all for one's greatest attempt to unmake him. That had to count for something. His war was no longer on the streets of Japan. It was inside his own head. The battlefield was his own body. He pushed himself off the wall, his massive frame rising with a new sense of purpose. The movement was still clumsy, but it was his own. He looked down at his monstrous, gray hand, the one that had just turned a concrete pillar to dust. He remembered looking at his hands after first inheriting One for All, wondering if they could ever be the hands of a hero. The question was 1,000 times more complicated now. Slowly, with a will that felt like it could move mountains, he curled the 3 thick fingers and thumb inward. He made a fist. It was not a gesture of anger. It was an act of control. A statement. I am not a weapon. I am not a puppet. I am not just a Nomu. His reflection in the distant puddle was still there. The exposed brain, the dead eyes, the hulking frame. It was a monster. My name is Izuku Midoriya, he thought, the mental declaration ringing with the combined power of 9 souls. And my fight is not over. The common room of the Heights Alliance dormitory had never been so quiet. Usually, even at this late hour, it was a space filled with life. Kaminari and Cyril would be locked in a fierce video game battle, their shouts echoing off the high ceiling. Yayorozu might be patiently tutoring Ashido and Hagakure at the main table, a pot of her signature tea steaming between them. Ida would be patrolling, ensuring curfew was respected with loud, chopping motions. It was a space of controlled, chaotic, teenage energy, the sound of a family forged in fire and trauma. Tonight, the silence was a physical weight. It pressed down on the 20 students, no, 19, gathered on the couches and floor, a suffocating blanket woven from grief and disbelief. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stared at the man standing before them, their homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa. His face was, as always, a mask of stoicism, but the exhaustion etched around his eyes was deeper than they had ever seen. His usual slouch seemed more pronounced, as if the air itself was too heavy for him to stand straight. His capture weapon was wrapped loosely around his neck, a comforting weight that offered him none. He had gathered them here an hour ago with a single, terse message. Common room. Mandatory meeting. Now, and they had waited, a knot of anxiety tightening in the room with every passing second, because one of their own was missing. Izuku Midoriya had not returned from the Jaka hospital raid. They all knew the risks. They were soldiers in a war they were too young to fight, and casualties were inevitable. But this was Midoriya. The boy who broke himself to win. The boy who saw the good in everyone. The boy who was the class's undeniable, radiant heart. The idea of him not coming back was a fundamental impossibility, a tear in the fabric of their reality. As you know, Aizawa began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the silence like a dull knife. The operation against the Paranormal Liberation Front came at a great cost. We sustained heavy losses among the pro-hero ranks, and the damage to the city is extensive. He paused, his dark eyes sweeping over their faces, lingering for a fraction of a second on each one. He saw Uraraka, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. He saw Ida, his back ramrod straight, his face a grim mask of forced composure. He saw Todoroki, his expression unreadable, a cold stillness that bespoke a deep, internal turmoil. He saw Bakugo, leaning against a far wall, arms crossed, his face a thunderous scowl, radiating an aura of violent denial. There were student casualties as well. Aizawa continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was a teacher. His primary function, above all else, was to protect these kids. He had failed. During the fight to secure Tamura Shigaraki, Izuku Midoriya was separated from the main hero force, a collective intake of breath. Uraraka made a small, wounded sound. The reports from the scene are chaotic, Aizawa said, forcing himself to stick to the official, sanitized version of the story. It was a mercy, and it felt like a lie. But eyewitness accounts from the heroes present confirm that Midoriya engaged Shigaraki directly to protect them. He fought heroically. Aizawa's voice almost cracked on the word. In the ensuing chaos, Shigaraki unleashed a wave of destructive power. Midoriya was caught at the epicenter. The search and rescue teams found nothing. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just heavy. It was sharp, filled with the jagged edges of broken hope. Found nothing? Kirishima whispered, his voice hoarse. What does that mean? Aizawa's gaze was unflinching. He owed them the truth, however brutal. It means that due to the nature of Shigaraki's decay quirk at its peak, there was no body to recover. It means that Izuku Midoriya is officially listed as killed in action. The words hung in the air, monstrous and unbelievable. And then, the dam of silence broke. It was Achiko Uraraka who shattered it. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. It wasn't a cry. It was a howl of loss. She doubled over, her hands flying to her mouth as if to hold the pain in, her whole body shaking with violent tremors. Tsuyu, sitting beside her, immediately wrapped her arms around her friend, her own large, dark eyes welling with tears. The sound broke the spell for the others. Jiro buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. Ojiro stared at the floor, his face pale and slack with shock. Kaminari looked like he'd been punched, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide and vacant. Tenya Ida shot to his feet, his body rigid, his glasses hiding his eyes. Aizawa-sensei, he declared, his voice unnaturally loud, strained with the effort of maintaining his composure. As class representative, I must insist that we remain strong. Midoriya-kun was a pillar of our class, and he would want us to uphold the values of UA with discipline and resolve in the face of this tragedy. We must not succumb to despair. Each word was a shield, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that had just dissolved into chaos. But his rigid posture, the tremor in his hands he tried to hide behind his back, betrayed him. He wasn't a pillar. He was a statue trying not to crumble. Throughout it all, Katsuki Bakugo hadn't moved. He just stared at Aizawa. His crimson eyes narrowed to slits. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in his chest. You're lying, he snarled, the words low and venomous. Aizawa's head snapped towards him. Bakugo. It was a warning. Don't Bakugo me, you goddamn mummy. He spat, pushing himself off the wall. He stalked forward, his movements like a caged tiger's. You really expect us to believe that? That the damn nerd who had but a solid steel beam just to prove a point would let himself get turned to dust? He's too damn stubborn to die like that. Kaken, please! Kirishima started, reaching out a hand. Bakugo whirled on him. Don't you start! You didn't know him! Not like I did! That useless bastard has the worst case of self-preservation I've ever seen, but he's a cockroach. He always gets back up. His voice was rising, cracking with a fury that was barely concealing a raw, screaming panic. This wasn't computing. It didn't fit the decades-long narrative of his life, a narrative that had, for better or worse, always had Izuku Midoriya in it. The evidence is conclusive, Aizawa said, his voice flat and final. Screw your evidence! Bakugo roared, tiny explosions crackling in his palms. The League has him. That's the only thing that makes sense. They took him, and you're all just sitting here, ready to put a damn flower on an empty desk. He stormed out of the common room, slamming the door so hard the frame shuddered and a picture on the wall fell to the floor with a crash. The sound echoed in the renewed, grief-stricken silence. No one knew what to say. They were mourning a death, and he was declaring a kidnapping. To them, he looked like a boy in denial. But to Bakugo, they looked like fools who had already given up. 2 days later, a memorial was held in one of UA's quiet courtyards. It wasn't a grand affair. There was no media, no fanfare. It was just for the students and staff. In the center of the manicured lawn, Cementos had raised a simple, unadorned plinth of gray concrete. It was stark, solid, and heartbreakingly empty. The students of Class 1A stood before it, dressed in their formal uniforms. The crisp black fabric felt like funeral shrouds. President Mike, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a somber quietness, gave a short, heartfelt speech about Midoriya's spirit, his heroic drive, his incandescent smile. All Might stood in the back, his skeletal form looking more fragile than ever, his face a hollow mask of sorrow. He couldn't speak. If he opened his mouth, he was afraid a torrent of guilt and regret would pour out that would never, ever stop. One by one, the students approached the plinth. Uraraka, her face pale and puffy, her eyes red-rimmed, placed a small, store-bought mochi on the stone, the kind he loved to snack on. She lingered for a moment, her hand trembling above the offering before she snatched it back and hurried away, a fresh wave of sobs racking her body. Ida placed a small, framed copy of the class photo, his movements precise and mechanical. Todoroki, silent and remote, laid a single white camellia at the base of the plinth, a flower that in the language of flowers meant waiting. He didn't seem to know why he chose it, only that it felt right. Bakugo stood apart from the group, his hands shoved in his pockets, his teeth grinding. He watched the procession with a look of utter contempt. This was a farce. A surrender. They were mourning a ghost, memorializing a lie. Deku wasn't dead. He couldn't be. Because if Deku was dead, then all the things Bakugo had never said, all the apologies lodged in his throat, all the complex, twisted guilt and rivalry and strange, burgeoning respect, it would all be for nothing. He would be left alone with the memory of his own cruelty, shouting at a gravestone. The thought was unbearable. When the last student had paid their respects, Nizu, the principal, stepped forward. Izuku Midoriya embodied the plus-ultra spirit more than any student I have ever had the privilege to teach, he said, his small, furry face grim. His legacy will not be one of loss, but one of inspiration. He has shown us the peak of heroism. Let us strive to be worthy of his sacrifice. Bakugo scoffed, a harsh, loud sound in the quiet courtyard. Sacrifice. He spat, kicking at a loose stone. You call giving up a sacrifice? Don't you dare tarnish his name with your bullshit. He turned and stalked away, ignoring the shocked looks and Aizawa's weary sigh. He had more important things to do than stand around a rock and cry. He had to find him. In a darkened, shielded room deep within the UA fortress, the truth was a far more terrifying thing. He taunted me, All Might whispered. His voice was a dry rattle in his throat. He sat hunched in a chair, his t-shirt hanging off his skeletal frame. He looked like a man who had aged a century in 2 days. Across the table, Niza sat perfectly still, a cup of untouched tea before him. Aizawa stood by the door, a sentinel of grim fury. "Tashinori, we have been over this," Niza said, his voice soft but firm. "The stress of the battle could have caused hallucinations. All for One is a master of psychological warfare. It wasn't a hallucination, Nizu," All Might insisted, looking up. The fire in his eyes, the symbol of peace, was gone. All that remained were two hollowed-out pits of despair. "He spoke to me, through the comms, a private channel, just for a moment. It was after the boy was gone," he said. All Might's voice broke. He took a ragged breath and forced the words out. He said, "Don't look so sad, All Might. Your little ninth isn't gone. I have him. Such a fine, resilient vessel. I think I'll take the liberty of remaking him in my own image." The words fell into the silence of the room with the force of a physical blow. Aizawa flinched, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. The official story, disintegration, was a mercy. This was a fate worse than any death imaginable. "He was lying," Aizawa said, his voice dangerously low. "He was trying to torture you, was he?" All Might shot back, a spark of his old fire igniting in his eyes before dying out just as quickly. "He created the Nomu. He has Dr. Garaki, the master of quark singularity and bioengineering. He saw the boy's potential, his resilience, the way his body held one for all. Why would he destroy such a perfect raw ingredient when he could corrupt it?" The horrific logic was undeniable. Izuku Midoriya was, from a purely scientific standpoint, a biological miracle. A body that could withstand the strain of One for All was a vessel of unparalleled potential. To a monster like All for One, he wasn't a hero, he was a resource. "I did this," All Might whispered, burying his face in his trembling hands. "I gave him that power. I put that target on his back. I led him to the slaughter. I told him you can become a hero, and I turned him into a monster's prize." Aizawa's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped along his cheek. His grief wasn't like All Might's. All Might's was the personal grief of a father for a lost son. Aizawa's was the cold, hard, professional rage of a shepherd who had led a wolf into his flock. He had trained Midoriya. He had pushed him, criticized him, and watched him grow. He had seen the boundless potential and the reckless self-sacrifice and had tried to temper the latter. And he had failed. He had failed to protect his student. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. His logical, rational mind had one clear takeaway. The League of Villains had crossed a line from which there was no return. This was no longer about justice. It was about eradication. "If what you say is true, Tashinori," Niza said, his black eyes glinting with a cold, calculating light, "then we are facing a new kind of threat. A weaponized version of one of our own, a psychological bomb waiting to be detonated." The principal, ever the strategist, was already looking past the grief to the tactical implications. "We will redouble our intelligence efforts. All resources will be focused on locating Garaki's hidden laboratories and any information pertaining to his Nomu projects. We will operate under the assumption that young Midoriya is alive, and that he is a hostage." He paused, his gaze hardening. "And a potential threat." Aizawa nodded, his purpose crystallizing. He would not rest. He would not stop. He would hunt them down to the ends of the earth. He would tear their organization apart, piece by piece, until he found his student. Whatever was left of him. The days that followed fell into a new, broken rhythm. An empty seat in the front row of Class 1A served as a constant, silent memorial. It was a black hole that warped the gravity of the entire room, pulling their glances, their thoughts, their energy into its void. Uraraka threw herself into training with a desperate intensity, but her movements were clumsy. Her quirk, once an expression of her light, bubbly personality, now felt heavy and unwieldy. She would float an object and feel a crushing weight in her own chest, as if she were mourning for the very concept of weightlessness. Todoroki grew even quieter, his dual nature seemingly at war within him. He trained relentlessly, encasing entire training grounds in ice and then melting them with furious bursts of flame, as if trying to find a balance that could somehow make sense of a world that had lost its center. Bakugo was a ghost. He attended classes, his face a mask of simmering rage. He participated in training, his explosions more violent and uncontrolled than ever. But in his free time, he wasn't with the others. He was hunched over a tablet in his room, hacking into police databases, cross-referencing witness reports from the raid, scanning underground forums for any chatter about a new, high-value League captive. He was hunting. His guilt was a fire in his belly, the memory of a younger, sneering him telling Deku to take a swan dive off the roof, playing on a loop in his mind. He had to find him. He had to save him. It was the only way to silence the ghosts of his own making. The rest of the class tried to move forward, but the camaraderie was fragile. Their laughter was quieter, their conversations more subdued. They were a family with a hole ripped through its center, and none of them knew how to patch it. It was a week after the memorial, late at night. Aizawa and a hollowed-out All Might were in a monitoring room, reviewing reconnaissance data from a new raid on a suspected League outpost. It had turned up nothing. The silence between them was thick with shared failure. A news alert flashed on one of the secondary screens. It was a local channel, breaking news. We're getting reports of a major disturbance in the abandoned Kamino Ward industrial sector. A frantic reporter's voice said over shaky, amateur footage. It appears to be a villain attack, but details are scarce. Eyewitnesses describe a monster. Aizawa's eyes flicked to the screen, his interest piqued. All Might continued to stare blankly at the tactical map. The footage was grainy, taken from a smartphone camera from a rooftop several blocks away. It showed a hulking, dark figure moving with unnatural speed through the derelict streets. It was massive, far larger than a normal person. It smashed through a brick wall as if it were made of paper. A group of low-level villains, opportunists trying to take advantage of the post-war chaos, were scattering before it. The creature is displaying incredible strength, the reporter narrated, her voice tight with fear. And it appears to have multiple quirks. We're getting reports of some kind of energy absorption and regeneration? It's impossible to be certain from this distance. Multiple quirks. The phrase hung in the air. Aizawa leaned closer to the screen, his heart starting to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. All Might finally looked up, his weary eyes drawn to the chaotic scene. The creature on the screen grabbed one of the fleeing villains, not with a killing blow, but with a clumsy, powerful shove that sent the man sprawling, unharmed but terrified. It was brutal, but not lethal. Then it turned and smashed a truck that had been about to be used as a getaway vehicle. The destruction was immense, but it was targeted. Then, the camera zoomed in. For a split second, the image stabilized. They saw the creature's form clearly. The grotesquely oversized muscles. The patchwork of scarred skin. And most horribly, the exposed, pulsating brain, encased in a translucent dome. It was a Nomu. A high-end. Aizawa felt the blood drain from his face. All Might let out a choked, gagging sound, his hand flying to his mouth. It's unlike any Nomu we've seen before, the reporter stammered. There's a strange energy signature, a green bioluminescence around its limbs when it moves, green lightning. The camera shook violently as the person filming scrambled for cover, and the feed cut out, replaced by the news anchor's shocked face. But they had seen enough. Aizawa and All Might stared at the blank screen, the image of the monster burned into their retinas. The hulking form. The multiple quirks. The hint of green lightning. All for one's taunt echoed in the suffocating silence of the room. I have him. I think I'll remake him. They had been mourning a dead hero. They had been preparing for a hostage situation. The reality, the horrifying possibility now staring them in the face, was infinitely worse. It wasn't that Izuku Midoriya was dead. It was that he was alive, and he had been turned into the very thing he had sworn to fight. A monster was wearing their boy's soul. Hunger was a new and terrible language. In his old life, hunger had been a simple thing, a hollow feeling in his stomach after a long training session, a craving for his mother's katsudon, a signal easily satisfied. This new hunger was different. It was a primal, gnawing emptiness that started not in his stomach, but in his very cells. It was the insatiable demand of the super-regeneration quirk, a biological furnace that was constantly burning fuel to maintain his monstrous form and repair the microscopic damage of existence. It was a deep, cellular craving for protein, for calories, for raw biological matter. For 3 days, Izuku had huddled in the crushing darkness of the abandoned subway station, fighting a war on 2 fronts. The first was against the crushing despair that threatened to extinguish the flickering candle of his consciousness. The voices of the vestiges were a constant, grounding presence in his mind, a council of ghosts offering grim advice and quiet encouragement. Nana's gentle reminders of his own worth, the second's harsh insistence on discipline, the third's pragmatic focus on control. They were the only things keeping him sane. The second war was against this hunger. It was a low, constant growl in the back of his mind, a beast scratching at the door of his will. The rats that scuttled in the tunnels, once objects of mild disgust, now triggered a predatory focus that horrified him. He could smell them, hear their tiny heartbeats. The primal part of his brain, the Nomu's operating system, offered simple, brutal solutions. Catch. Kill. Eat. He fought it with every ounce of his being. He was Izuku Midoriya. He was a hero. He did not eat rats. He would rather starve. But the hunger was growing, evolving from a background hum into a sharp, stabbing pain. It made his thoughts sluggish, his control over his own body feel tenuous. The dormant virus of All for One's programming felt closer, a menacing presence lurking just beyond the veil of his willpower, waiting for him to weaken. You must consume something, ninth. The third user's voice rumbled in his mindscape. This body is a high-performance engine. It can't run on empty. The longer you starve it, the weaker your own mind will become. Primal instinct will take over. I can't, Izuku projected back, his mental voice thin and reedy. What am I supposed to eat? Garbage? I won't. I can't kill something. Then you must find another way. The second user stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Logic, boy. Use your head, not just your stomach. You are in an abandoned section of the city. There will be discarded food. Vending machines. Find sustenance. This is a survival problem. Solve it. The harsh, practical advice cut through the fog of his hunger-induced misery. He was a hero. Heroes solve problems. This was just a different kind of problem. With a groan of effort, he forced his massive body to its feet. The kinetic booster quirk, dormant for days, gave a faint, eager thrum at the movement. He ignored it. Control. That was the mantra. Control every twitch, every step. He began the slow, heavy shamble back towards the light, his new senses on high alert. He wasn't looking for prey. He was looking for a solution. He emerged from the subway entrance into the gray light of late afternoon. The sky was overcast, casting the derelict industrial district in a bleak, uniform light. The world seemed drained of color. He moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows cast by crumbling warehouses and rusted-out silos. He was a 9-foot-tall monster with an exposed brain. Subtlety was not his strong suit. The fear of being seen was a cold knot in his gut. He found a rusted, broken-down vending machine behind a defunct factory. It had been vandalized years ago, the glass shattered, the front panel pried open. But inside, miraculously, were a few faded packages of stale protein bars and a bottle of some long-expired sports drink. To his old self, it would have been garbage. To his new body, it was a banquet. His claws, designed for rending and piercing, were clumsy. He fumbled with the packages, his massive fingers crushing one of the protein bars into a fine powder. With a frustrated grunt, he managed to tear another one open. He stared at the dry, crumbly bar. It looked unappetizing, but the scent of it, calories, sugar, protein, made the hunger beast roar in his mind. He brought it to his beak-like maw. The lipless seam parted just enough for him to shove the bar inside. The texture was like chalk, the taste a stale, chemical sweetness. But as he swallowed, he felt a wave of profound relief wash over him. The sharpest edge of the hunger receded. It was fuel. It was survival. He was just finishing the last bar when he heard it. Shouts. A scream. The distinct, sharp crack of a quirk activating. The sounds came from a few streets over. They were sounds of violence, of conflict. They were the sounds he had dedicated his life to stopping. Immediately, every fiber of his being, both human and Nomu, snapped to attention. The hunger was forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it was almost painful. The low thrum of the kinetic booster intensified. The storm of one for all in his chest swirled, green lightning crackling. Trouble. His heroic instincts, the core of his very soul, screamed a single, undeniable command: go. Help them. But the logical, terrified part of his mind screamed back: no. You can't. Look at you. You'll scare them. You'll make it worse. You're a monster. Another scream, this one high-pitched with terror. A woman's voice. The debate was over. He could be a monster. He could be a freak. He could be a walking nightmare. But he could not, stand by and do nothing while someone was in danger. It was not in his programming. Not the programming of All for One, but the programming of Inko Midoriya and Tashinori Yagi. He moved. He didn't run. He flowed. The kinetic booster quirk, now fueled by days of pent-up energy and a fresh surge of adrenaline, sent him forward with a burst of speed that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The world blurred around him. He covered a city block in the time it would have taken him to take 3 steps before. He vaulted over a chain-link fence, the metal groaning under the brief touch of his hand, and landed silently on the asphalt of an empty loading bay. He peered around the corner of a large shipping container. The scene was laid out before him, clear and horrifying to his enhanced vision. It was a family. A mother, a father, and a small child, a boy no older than 6. They were huddled against the graffitied brick wall of a warehouse. Their car, an old, beat-up sedan, had apparently broken down, its hood up, smoke still curling from the engine. They had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Surrounding them were 3 men. Low-level villains, opportunists picking at the city's bones in the post-war chaos. One was a large, brutish man with skin that could harden into a rock-like texture. The second was wiry and fast, his hands crackling with a low-grade electrical quirk. The third, clearly the leader, had a smug, cruel look on his face and was idly generating small, sharp blades of bone from his knuckles. "Come on, now!" the blade villain sneered, gesturing with his bony claws. "Just give us the wallet, the watch, and whatever else you got, and we'll be on our way. Don't make this difficult. We don't have anything," the father pleaded, spreading his arms protectively in front of his wife and son. "Please, just let us go. Our boy, he's got a cute kid." The electric villain chuckled, his eyes glinting. "Maybe we should take him for insurance." The mother let out a terrified cry and pulled her son tighter, shielding him with her body. The boy was crying, silent tears streaming down his face. Izuku felt a surge of cold, righteous fury that was so pure, so intensely him, that it momentarily silenced all the monstrous noise in his head. This was it. This was why he had endured the pain, the training, the broken bones. To stop this. To stop this casual, predatory cruelty. His mind, the analytical brain that had filled notebooks with hero data, took over. 3 hostiles. Close quarters combat. 1 brute force type, likely slow. 1 range/shock type, likely fast but fragile. 1 leader, melee, piercing attacks. Civilian hostages are the priority. Objective, neutralize threats, protect civilians. Non-lethal force only. The last thought was a desperate plea to his own body. He had seen what his fist did to a concrete pillar. A punch like that would turn a human being into a red mist. He had to control it. He had to be a surgeon with a sledgehammer. He took a deep breath, a rasping, wheezing sound, and stepped out from behind the container. The moment he entered their line of sight, the world stopped. The villains, the family, everyone froze. The sneer on the leader's face dissolved into slack-jawed disbelief, then morphed into raw terror. The father, who had been trying to be brave, made a choked, gurgling sound and stumbled back, pressing his family harder against the wall. The mother's eyes went wide, her scream dying in her throat. They weren't looking at a hero. They weren't looking at a savior. They were looking at a monster that had just crawled out of their worst nightmares. His appearance was a weapon in itself. The 9-foot frame that blocked out the sky. The pale, scarred skin. The dead, black eyes. And the brain. The horrible, exposed, pulsating brain. What in the hell is that?" The rock-skinned villain stammered, taking an involuntary step back. The leader recovered first, his fear transmuting into aggression. "A Nomu? What's a High-End doing out here? Did the League send you?" "We're on the same side, big guy." Izuku didn't respond. He couldn't. He just stood there, a silent, hulking monolith of judgment, his gaze fixed on them. "They think you are an ally," the second user's voice noted in his mind. "A tactical advantage. Use it." Izuku took a slow, deliberate step forward. The ground seemed to tremble. "Hey! I'm talking to you!" the blade villain shouted, his bravado clearly forced. "We're just collecting a toll. You can have a cut." Izuku took another step. He was closing the distance, his movements slow, measured. He had to be careful. So careful. The electric villain got spooked. "I'm not waiting around for this freak!" he yelled, and unleashed a torrent of crackling blue electricity directly at Izuku's chest. Izuku's mind screamed, bracing for the jolt, the burn. But the electricity didn't jolt him. It was like stepping into a warm bath. The blue tendrils of energy washed over his skin and were simply gone. He felt a pleasant, tingling sensation as his body drank the energy. Shock absorption. It didn't just work on kinetic force. It worked on energy. The villain might as well have been trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The villain's eyes widened in horror. It did nothing! That was the opening. Izuku's body exploded into motion. The kinetic booster, fed by the absorbed energy, launched him forward. He wasn't just fast. He was instantaneous. In the space of a single heartbeat, he crossed the remaining 20 feet and was standing directly in front of the electric villain. The man had no time to react. Izuku's hand, a massive gray claw, shot out. But he didn't punch. He didn't claw. He remembered every lesson from Aizawa, every bit of training on disarming and incapacitation. With a delicacy that was utterly at odds with his monstrous form, he opened his hand and delivered a precise, open-palmed strike to the villain's chest. It was a love tap. A gentle push by his standards. For the villain, it was like being hit by a freight train. The air blasted from the man's lungs in a single, explosive whoosh. He was lifted off his feet and sent flying backwards, tumbling end over end until he slammed into a dumpster 20 yards away with a sickening clang of metal. He slumped to the ground, unconscious, but Izuku prayed, alive, one down. The other two stared in stunned silence for a split second before reacting. "Kill it!" the leader screamed, lunging forward, the bone blades on his knuckles extending into wicked, sharp points. Simultaneously, the rock-skinned villain roared, his body transforming, his skin becoming a thick, gray, craggy hide. He charged, a living battering ram. They were trying to pincer him. A basic but effective tactic. Izuku's mind worked faster than his body. Brute force from the right. Piercing from the left. Civilians are behind me. Cannot dodge backwards. Cannot let them get past. He didn't dodge. He planted his feet. The rock-skinned villain slammed into his side with the force of a car crash. The sound was a dull, grinding thud. Izuku didn't budge. He didn't even grunt. The shock absorption quirk drank the momentum, negating the impact entirely. It felt like a child had bumped into him. He felt the coiled power in his legs increase. At the same time, the leader's bone blades stabbed at his chest. Izuku didn't have time to shield himself. The sharp points, which could have pierced steel plate, raked across his torso, tearing through his mutated flesh. For a glorious, horrifying moment, he felt pain. Sharp, real, familiar pain. It was almost a relief. Then, just as quickly, the super regeneration quirk kicked in. The deep gashes, which should have been gushing blood, sizzled and knit themselves closed before his very eyes. The skin bubbled, fused, and smoothed over, leaving only a faint, red discoloration that was already fading. By the time the villain pulled his blades back for another strike, the wounds were completely gone. The leader stared at his bone claws, then at Izuku's pristine chest, his mind utterly failing to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Izuku used his momentary confusion. He grabbed the rock villain's arm, his grip like a vice. The man struggled, but it was like a fly caught in amber. Izuku pivoted, using the villain's own momentum against him. With a grunt of effort, more for show than actual need, He lifted the heavy man off his feet and swung him like a club, straight into the path of the charging blade villain. The two criminals collided with a sickening crunch of rock on bone. They collapsed in a tangled, groaning heap. Two more down. Neutralized. Silence descended on the loading bay once more, broken only by the whimpering of the small child. Izuku stood over the fallen villains, his massive chest heaving with a breath he didn't need. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him feeling hollow. He had done it. He had protected them. He had been a hero. A wave of relief, of pure, triumphant joy, washed over him. He had controlled the power. He had saved the innocent. He was still himself. He was still a hero. He turned, a gesture of reassurance forming in his mind. He wanted to give them a thumbs up, the way All Might did. He wanted to tell them it was okay, that they were safe now. But his body couldn't make a thumbs up. And he couldn't speak, so he just turned. And he saw their faces. They were not looking at him with gratitude. They were not looking at him with relief. They were looking at him with pure, undiluted terror. The father had his wife and son behind him, his body a trembling, pathetic shield. The mother was staring at him, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide saucers of horror. And the little boy, the child he had just saved, was pointing a shaking finger at him. "Monster!" The boy whispered, the word a tiny, devastating dagger in the quiet air. The father finally found his voice. Get back!" he stammered, his voice cracking. "Don't hurt us. Please!" They weren't cowering from the villains anymore. They were cowering from him. The joy inside Izuku curdled and died, replaced by a cold, crushing despair that was 1,000 times worse than the hunger or the fear he'd felt in the tunnel. He had saved them. He had fought for them, and they saw him as the greater threat. He had won the battle, but he had lost the one thing he was fighting for, their hearts. Nana Shimura's words echoed in his mind, a tragic, bitter irony. A real hero saves hearts. He had failed. He took a half-step toward them, an instinctive gesture of reassurance. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The family flinched back as if he had swung at them. The father grabbed a discarded tire iron from the ground, holding it up like a flimsy sword. "Stay away from us!" The gesture broke Izuku's heart. He, Izuku Midoriya, who had dreamed his entire life of being a symbol of hope and safety, was now the thing people armed themselves against. He could see himself through their eyes. He hadn't been a hero performing a precise, non-lethal takedown. He had been a monster, a terrifying creature that had absorbed electricity, regenerated from fatal wounds, and used another man as a weapon before turning its dead, black eyes on them. They hadn't seen a rescue. They had seen a predator dispatching its rivals. He had saved their lives, but he had shattered their sense of safety. He was no different from the villains. He was just a bigger monster. The wail of distant police sirens began to cut through the air. The sound, once a comforting signal that help was on the way, was now a death knell. They wouldn't see a hero standing over 3 defeated villains. They would see a Heian Nomu, the most wanted type of creature in Japan, standing over 3 victims next to a terrified family. They would open fire without hesitation. He had to go. With a final, lingering look at the family, a look that he hoped conveyed an apology, a sorrow that he could never voice, he turned. He didn't want to run. He wanted to stay, to explain, to fix this. But there was nothing to fix. He launched himself upwards, his powerful legs propelling him to the roof of the warehouse in a single, silent leap. He landed with a soft thud that still shook the building. From his new vantage point he looked down. He saw the police cars swarming into the loading bay. He saw the family pointing up at him, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. He fled, melting back into the concrete jungle of the industrial district, the word monster echoing in his head. The heroic instincts had driven him to act, but his monstrous actions had defined the outcome. He was a paradox, a living contradiction. A savior who inspired terror. A hero who looked like the villain. He retreated to the darkness of his subway tunnel, the stale protein bars and expired sports drink doing nothing to fill the new, gaping hole that had been torn open in his soul. He had tried to be a hero, and the world had screamed. The world outside UA's walls had become Bakugo's private hunting ground. While his classmates processed their grief through rigorous training and quiet memorials, Bakugo processed his through a furious, obsessive, and clandestine investigation. He poured every ounce of his volatile energy into it, his grief and guilt sublimating into a white-hot, singular focus. Deku wasn't dead. He refused to accept it. And if he wasn't dead, he was taken. It was the only explanation that his mind, which had orbited the infuriating, inspiring presence of Izuku Midoriya for his entire life, would allow. Sleep became a stranger. His nights were spent hunched over a reinforced tablet in his room, the glow of the screen illuminating a face taut with feral concentration. He bypassed UA's network filters with a surprising knack for brute force hacking, diving into the murky depths of police databases, encrypted hero network servers, and the dark web forums where villainous scum bragged and bartered. He was looking for a ghost. A whisper. Any mention of a new, high-value asset acquired by the League. His search yielded nothing but frustrating dead ends. The League had gone to ground after the war, their leadership shattered. There was no chatter, no victory speech, no ransom demand. Just a chilling, unnerving silence. It gnawed at him, feeding the frantic, terrified part of his brain that whispered, "What if they're right? What if he's really gone?" He would silence that voice with another 20-hour research binge, fueled by cheap energy drinks and pure, unadulterated spite. He cross-referenced every report from the Jaku raid, building a three-dimensional map of the battle in his mind. He pinpointed the exact location where Deku was last seen, a cratered wasteland at the epicenter of Shigaraki's decay wave. He memorized the eyewitness statements, the timelines, the chaotic comms chatter. He knew the official story was that Deku was disintegrated. But Bakugo had seen Shigaraki's power. It was terrifying, but it wasn't absolute. It radiated. It had a range. If Deku had been at the very edge, or if he'd used one for all to, what? Blast himself clear? It was possible. Unlikely, but not impossible. Deku specialized in the impossible. Then came the news report. The monster, in the Kamino ward. Aizawa had shut it down quickly, claiming it was a stray Nomu from the Jaku battle that the heroes were already tracking, a simple mop-up operation. He had forbidden any students from getting involved. But Bakugo had seen the footage before it was scrubbed from the net. He'd seen the hulking form, the unnatural speed, and for a split second, a flicker of what looked hauntingly like green lightning. The Kamino ward. The same place they had fought all for one. The same place Bakugo himself had been rescued. The geographic coincidence was too much to ignore. A new theory, wild and horrifying, began to form in the dark corners of his mind. The League didn't just take him. They did something to him. That thing in the video, it fought like a beast, but it moved with a terrifying purpose. It had displayed a suite of powers consistent with a high-end Nomu. But that green lightning, that was Deku's. His investigation shifted. He was no longer looking for a captive. He was hunting a monster. He started skipping his afternoon training, slipping away from campus using routes he had scouted for just such an occasion. Aizawa was watching him, he knew. The man's tired, knowing eyes followed him everywhere. But Aizawa was also stretched thin, dealing with the fallout of the war, and Bakugo was an expert at being difficult. He made his way to the derelict industrial park on the outskirts of the Kamino ward, the site of the recent disturbance. It was a ghost town of rusted metal and broken concrete. He searched the area with a forensic intensity. He found the loading bay from the news report. He saw the unconscious, low-level thugs being loaded into police vans. He noted the destroyed concrete pillar, the massive crater in the side of a dumpster. The sheer, overwhelming power on display here was terrifying, but he also found something else. Near a vandalized vending machine, half crushed in the dirt, was the wrapper of a Plus Ultra Protein bar. The same brand that was stocked in the UA training facilities. The same brand he'd seen Deku choke down 1,000 times. It was a breadcrumb. A tiny, insignificant clue that screamed at him. Nomu didn't stop for snack breaks. They didn't eat protein bars. They were mindless puppets. But what if one wasn't? He widened his search, spiraling out from the loading bay. He was looking for a lair. A place a creature that size could hide, a place it could retreat to. He imagined being that thing. He'd want darkness, seclusion. A place below ground. His eyes scanned the landscape, and he saw it. The crumbling archway of an abandoned subway entrance. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and anticipation. He descended the stairs, his palms sweating, tiny crackles of nitroglycerin popping in the damp air. The tunnel was pitch black and smelled of rot and stagnant water. He created a small, continuous explosion in his palm, a makeshift torch that cast flickering, dancing shadows on the grimy, tiled walls. "Deku!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the oppressive silence. "If you're in here, you useless nerd, show yourself! Or are you too much of a coward?" He was shouting insults, his default mode of communication with Midoriya, but the words were hollow. They were a plea. Please be here. Please be anything but dead. His light caught something on the floor. A massive footprint, sunk into a patch of grime, far too large to be human. He followed the tracks deeper into the tunnel, his every sense on high alert. The air grew colder, heavier. He could hear something now. A low, rhythmic sound, like a faulty, massive bellows. Breathing. He rounded a corner, and the light from his palm fell upon it. It was slumped against the far wall, its hulking form a study in monstrous anatomy. It was even bigger up close, a mountain of scarred gray flesh and unnaturally dense muscle. Its head was bowed, the exposed brain on its skull pulsating with a soft, eerie, greenish light. It was the creature from the video. The Nomu. For a moment, Bakugo just stared, his mind struggling to process the sight. This was it. The culmination of his hunt. The thing that might be his friend, or the thing that might have killed his friend. The Nomu's head snapped up, its dead, black eyes fixing on him. There was no recognition in them. No intelligence. Just the flat, predatory gaze of a cornered beast. Bakugo's fear was instantly incinerated by a wave of pure, unadulterated rage. Rage at the League for doing this. Rage at this thing for existing. Rage at himself for being here, for having to even entertain this horrifying possibility. "You!" he roared, his voice cracking. He didn't know who he was even talking to anymore. "Where is he? Where's Deku? What did you do to him, you goddamn monster?" He didn't wait for an answer. He lunged. This wasn't a spar. It wasn't a fight for points. It was an exorcism. He propelled himself forward with a massive explosion, his body a missile aimed at the creature's center mass. AP shot! The focused, armor-piercing blast shot from his palm. It was an attack that could punch through concrete. It slammed into the Nomu's chest and dissipated. The force vanished, absorbed into the creature's hide with a dull thud, leaving behind not so much as a scorch mark. The Nomu grunted, a low, guttural sound of surprise, and stumbled back a step from the sheer kinetic force. But it was unharmed. Bakugo's eyes widened in disbelief. He didn't hesitate. He was on it in a second, his movements a fluid dance of destruction. He swung his leg, aiming a powerful kick at its knee. It was like kicking a granite statue. He bounced off, the impact jarring his entire leg. "Die!" he screamed, unleashing a volley of explosions, a continuous barrage of light and sound and fury that illuminated the tunnel in a hellish, strobing light. The blast washed over the Nomu's body. It raised its massive arms to shield its head, but it didn't attack back. It just stood there, weathering the storm, the concussive force of the explosions barely making it flinch. Inside the Nomu's mind, Izuku was in hell. The sudden appearance of Bakugo, the familiar angry roar, the explosive light, it was a sensory sledgehammer. He had been so lost in his own despair that he hadn't heard him coming. "Kaken!" The name was a silent scream in his mind. "Stop! It's me!" But his body wouldn't respond with words. The instincts of the Nomu, faced with a sudden, violent assault, were taking over. The hunger beast, the cornered animal, wanted to lash out. It wanted to meet violence with overwhelming, superior violence. He could feel the kinetic booster and shock absorption quirks humming, eagerly drinking in the energy from Bakugo's attacks, converting it into coiled, devastating potential in his own limbs. A single swipe of his arm would end this. It would break his childhood friend, his rival, the one person he was so desperate to see. "Control it, Ninth!" The second user's voice barked in his head. This is the test. Do not let the beast answer for you. Hold it back. Izuku poured every ounce of his will, every scrap of his consciousness, into a single command: don't fight back. He locked his own muscles, fighting his body from the inside. He turned himself into a living punching bag, a silent stone absorbing the hurricane of Bakugo's rage and grief. The impacts were nothing, but the effort of holding his own body in check was the hardest thing he had ever done. Bakugo was relentless. He was screaming, incoherent phrases of rage and loss, his attacks becoming more desperate, more powerful. Tell me where he is! I'll kill you! I'll kill you and I'll find him, he was crying. Bakugo wasn't aware of it, but hot, furious tears were streaming down his face, sizzling away in the heat of his own explosions. He was fighting the monster, but he was raging at the universe. The fight, if it could be called that, was entirely one-sided. The Nomu was purely defensive, its movements sluggish and minimal. It absorbed, it blocked, it weathered. It did not retaliate. This fact began to slowly pierce the red haze of Bakugo's fury. This wasn't how a Heian fought. The one he'd seen at Jakku, the ones on TV, they were engines of pure, mindless aggression. They attacked relentlessly. This thing, it was just taking it. Bakugo began to tire, his movements growing ragged, his explosions losing some of their punch. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. He finally paused, bent over, his hands on his knees, sweat and tears dripping onto the grimy floor. The Nomu just stood there, its arms still raised defensively, its massive chest heaving. Why? Bakugo panted, looking up at the creature. Why won't you fight back, you bastard? Suddenly, the ceiling above them groaned. The constant, percussive force of Bakugo's explosions had weakened the ancient, decaying structure of the tunnel. A large chunk of concrete and twisted rebar, the size of a small car, detached and began to fall, directly over Bakugo's head. He was too exhausted to react in time. He looked up, his eyes wide, able only to brace for the impact. He never felt it. The Nomu moved with a speed that defied its size and previous sluggishness. It crossed the space between them in a single, blurred motion. A massive gray arm, impossibly fast, shot out, not to strike him, but to shield him. The huge, clawed hand opened, forming a protective canopy over Bakugo's head. The chunk of ceiling crashed down onto the Nomu's outstretched arm with a deafening roar and a cloud of dust. The impact would have crushed a tank. The Nomu grunted, a deep, pained sound, and its knees buckled slightly under the immense weight. But it held. The arm that could have annihilated Bakugo was now his shield, taking the blow that was meant for him. The dust began to settle. Bakugo stood frozen under the shelter of the monster's arm, staring up at the creature that had just saved his life. He saw the pulverized concrete sliding off its limb. He saw the deep gouges and fractures in its flesh from the rebar, and then he saw them heal. The wounds sizzled, bubbled, and sealed themselves shut in a matter of seconds, the super-regeneration quirk at work. But that wasn't what made him freeze. It was the way it had moved. That specific, explosive burst of speed from a defensive stance, using stored kinetic energy for a sudden lunge. It was a move he recognized. A move Deku had been working on for months with his own quirk. A move they had discussed, argued over, theorized about during their strange, unspoken post-battle analysis sessions. It was Deku's move, and then, another arm moved. This one wasn't shielding him. It was reaching for him. But it didn't reach with a claw. Tendrils of pure, crackling black energy erupted from the Nomu's arm, whipping through the air. Black Whip. A quirk that no one, not even the rest of Class 1A, knew Deku had. All Might had told Bakugo about the vestiges, about the other quirks waking up inside One for All, in a moment of shared, desperate confidence. The black tendrils didn't attack him. They shot past him, wrapping around a large, unstable section of the tunnel wall that the impact had loosened, securing it, preventing a further collapse that would have buried them both. It was a protective, instinctive, heroic action. Bakugo's world tilted on its axis. The speed. The protective instinct. The familiar fighting style buried under a mountain of flesh. And Black Whip. A secret within a secret. His rage evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror that was so cold it felt like ice water flooding his veins. His breathing hitched. He looked past the monstrous form, past the exposed brain and the scarred flesh. He looked directly into the creature's eyes. They were still dead black orbs. But for the first time, he thought he saw something behind them. Not intelligence, not in the way he understood it. It was something deeper, a desperate, terrified, trapped light. The look of a prisoner screaming behind soundproof glass. He saw a flicker of the same desperate eyes that had looked up at him from the sludge villain all those years ago. The Nomu slowly, carefully, lowered its arm as it shrugged off the remaining rubble. It stood before him, its posture no longer threatening, but resigned. It slumped slightly, a posture of exhausted surrender. Bakugo's own body was trembling, not from exertion, but from shock. His mind was racing, connecting the impossible dots. The protein bar. The defensive posture. The specific combat maneuver. Black whip? The eyes. It can't be. It's not possible. It's a trick. It's a lie. But the evidence was overwhelming, a tidal wave of truth that washed away all his denial. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He tried again, forcing the air from his lungs. The word was not a shout. It was not an accusation. It was a whisper, fragile and broken and filled with a universe of horror and disbelief. Deku?